Ah, Thomas Jefferson, Tommy J, the Jester. Whatever you call him, TJ was one of the founders of the United States. Not only that, but he also drafted the Constitution, wrote his own Bible, and was a bastion of equal rights. Or was he? Isn't this the guy who had 600 slaves, had an affair with a slave under his ownership, and even allowed his own family he had from said affair to be sold off? Well, my friend, it's a hell of a tragic contradiction on his part. But both things may actually be true. And today, that's what we will be digging into on the Historical History Channel. Let's start with what Jefferson said, or rather wrote, especially during his political career. In 1776, he wrote the first draft of a document called, what was it again? It's a very obscure oh yes, the Declaration of Independence. In this writing, a famous passage made it into the final draft.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Powerful statement for sure, and it's the one many Americans cite when talking about their rights. What makes themselves no better or no worse than anyone else? But it speaks further than that, especially during a time where slavery was common, not only in the American colonies, but around the world. Thomas Jefferson wanted to go further, though. In his original draft of the Declaration of Independence in June 1776, Jefferson included a powerful paragraph condemning King George III for perpetuating the transatlantic slave trade.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere.
Jefferson accused the British king of waging war against human nature by allowing the enslavement of Africans and encouraging slave revolts among American enslaved people. Why was that passage eventually removed? Well, we have a documentary on the process the Declaration of Independence went through, if you want to check that out. After this video, of course. Don't you dare leave. Link to that video is in the description. After the country declared independence in 1785, when the country was under the Articles of Confederation, we have a link for that video too in the description. Thomas Jefferson published Notes on the State of Virginia, his only full-length book, and arguably his most candid political and philosophical writing. In it, Jefferson lays bare his beliefs on everything from natural resources to education, and, crucially, slavery and race. Jefferson called slavery a moral and political threat to America's future. He wrote,
"The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submissions on the other."
When you compare Jefferson to his contemporaries, his public stances were bold and progressive. A man truly worthy of standing amongst the legendary League of Fathers. But what if things aren't that simple? What if behind all the bashing on slavery was a man who owned roughly 600 slaves in his lifetime? In fact, during his drafting of the Declaration of Independence, he owned 200 slaves. Jefferson's estate at Monticello was not just a residence. It was a self-contained agricultural operation powered almost entirely by enslaved people. What did they do? Tobacco cultivation. It was a labor-intensive crop, grown by enslaved workers in harsh conditions. Later, when tobacco depleted the soil, Jefferson switched to wheat, corn, and other grains, also farmed by enslaved labor. He had enslaved artisans on site, such as blacksmiths, nail makers, carpenters, coopers, textile workers, and even house servants. All unpaid labor. Sounds like Monticello was a huge moneymaker. With all that unpaid labor, TJ should be rolling in dough in his underwear. But actually, Jefferson was often in debt. He used his enslaved people as collateral to take out loans. In many cases, the interest on his debts was covered by the labor of enslaved people who worked the land, made nails, or were hired out to others. All right, hold up. Let's slow this train down and play devil's advocate here for a moment. Maybe Jefferson was really against slavery, but given the time he lived in, he had no choice. He inherited over 100 enslaved people through his father and father-in-law, part of Virginia's plantation aristocracy. Maybe the system was too big to fight. Well, keep in mind, Thomas Jefferson was President of the United States at one point. Jefferson did not do anything truly meaningful as president to stop slavery. While he took one limited action, the banning of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, his overall presidency did nothing to challenge the institution of slavery within the United States. And in some ways, his policies helped entrench it further, with slavery expanding into the new Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the U.S. Jefferson even appointed pro-slavery judges and officials, maintaining a government that would protect slaveholder interests for decades. While the transatlantic ban on slavery may look good on paper, it just embroiled old problems and created new ones. Bottom line, Jefferson occasionally wrote privately about the evil of slavery and his hope that future generations might end it. But he consistently avoided acting on those views and benefited financially from slavery throughout his presidency. Okay. So maybe he wasn't perfect. Maybe he was afraid of political consequences, but he obviously felt it was bad to enslave people, right? Well, not exactly.
You see, whenever Tommy Boy would go against slavery, the underlying reasoning wasn't because he felt black people should be equal and treated like free Americans. He feared what slavery would do to white slaveholders, corrupting their morals, fostering cruelty, and turning Republican virtue into tyranny. But rarely did he write with real empathy for the enslaved people themselves. His concern was less for their suffering than for how slavery might poison the soul of the Republic. Despite claiming slavery was a moral depravity, he never attempted to transition Monticello to paid labor or to reduce dependence on the system. We have records of Jefferson's notes he used to articulate his views on black people. And here, the mask of Enlightenment reason slips.
I advance it that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments, both of body and mind.
Jefferson speculated that black people were naturally less intelligent, less capable of emotion, less beautiful, and even less prone to romantic love, which we will be circling back to soon, trust me. These weren't offhand remarks. They were part of a structured racial worldview.
Their griefs are transient. They seem to require less sleep. They are more ardent after their female.
These deeply dehumanizing stereotypes were not only false, they were used for generations to justify slavery, segregation, and racial inequality. And it gets worse. Even when Jefferson endorsed gradual emancipation, he insisted that freed black people must be expelled from America. He wrote,
Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race.
In short, he didn't believe black and white Americans could live together in freedom. So his solution was colonization, forced deportation of freed people to Africa or the Caribbean. But, continuing his trend of being inconsistent, he made no actions as president to do this. All right, so he was racist and contradicted himself. But he is a product of his time. It's not like he had an affair with an underage slave, enslaved his own children from that affair, and had extended family languish in the abominable, dehumanizing slave trade for generations. Right? Right? Well, Sally Hemings was born into slavery in 1773 at Monticello, but she wasn't just any enslaved woman. She was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife, Martha Wales Jefferson. They shared the same father, a white Virginia planter named John Wales. That made Sally Hemings three-quarters white by ancestry and part of what was called the mulatto class, enslaved people of mixed race who often worked as domestic servants and were subject to sexual exploitation. In 1787, 14-year-old Sally Hemings was brought to Paris, where Jefferson was serving as U.S. minister to France. There, slavery was illegal, but Jefferson kept her in his household as a maid to his daughter Polly. Historians believe it was in Paris, when Jefferson was in his 40s and Hemings around 16, that their relationship began. So that not only was Jefferson a racist, but he would also be a predator by today's standards. Hemings could have petitioned for her freedom in France, but likely didn't due to age, pressure, and family ties. She later returned voluntarily to Monticello under the condition, according to her son Madison, that her children would be freed. Sally Hemings had at least 6 children believed to be fathered by Jefferson. Harriet, who died in infancy, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, Eston, and a 6th unnamed child also died in infancy. All were born into slavery because their status followed the condition of the mother per Virginia law. Jefferson was a meticulous record-keeper. He tracked enslaved people's births, labor hours, and daily duties. Sally Hemings' children all appeared on his plantation records, but he never acknowledged paternity. So did Jefferson know they were his children? The historical consensus is yes. He knew and acted accordingly. Hemings' children were freed or allowed to escape, something Jefferson rarely permitted. No other family member consistently present at Monticello fits the timeline of fatherhood. And probably most importantly, DNA evidence published in 1998 confirmed a Jefferson male fathered Eston Hemings, strongly supporting Thomas as the father. Even Jefferson's political opponents in the 1800s accused him publicly of the relationship. He never addressed the charges, neither confirming nor denying them. By the 1790s, Jefferson was deeply in debt and increasingly desperate to turn Monticello into a profitable operation. Tobacco had failed due to soil exhaustion, and wheat was only marginally profitable. Looking for cash flow, Jefferson launched a small industrial venture, a nail-making factory. But rather than hire skilled tradesmen, he chose a cheaper, more brutal option: enslaved boys. The nailery was located in a small shop near Jefferson's main house. It was staffed almost exclusively by 10 to 16-year-old boys, including several from the Hemings family. They worked long hours at furnaces and anvils, exposed to high heat and sharp tools. They were expected to produce thousands of nails per day and beaten if they failed to meet quotas. The nailery quickly became one of Monticello's most profitable enterprises. It generated steady cash income for Jefferson during the 1790s. Nails were sold across Virginia, branded as a Monticello product. And the profits didn't just keep the estate afloat. They helped Jefferson maintain his lifestyle, books, wines, and social life. All of it was built on the labor of enslaved black boys, treated as cogs in a money-making machine. One of Jefferson's most disturbing statements appears in an 1820 letter where he wrote,
"A child raised every 2 years is of more profit than the crop of the best laboring man."
Jefferson wasn't just profiting from labor, he was profiting from reproduction. Enslaved women were expected to bear children regularly, and those children were treated as future capital investments. In his economic calculations, black children were cash crops, literally more valuable than grain or tobacco. And keep in mind, some of his own blood was a part of this disgusting operation, even though he seemed to favor his children who worked in the estate. Another contradiction from Jefferson? Say it ain't so. When Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, he left behind crippling debt of more than $100,000, equivalent to millions today. To settle it, his estate had to be liquidated. That meant they had to sell land, furniture, and books, and, most tragically, selling the people Jefferson enslaved. In 1827, over 130 enslaved men, women, and children were auctioned off in lots to repay Jefferson's creditors. This public sale shattered families and severed lifelong relationships, many of which had lasted for generations at Monticello. Jefferson's 4 enslaved children who made it to adulthood were freed. Beverly Hemings was allowed to escape Monticello around 1822. Harriet Hemings was allowed to leave and pass as white. Madison and Eston Hemings were freed in Jefferson's will. However, when it came to his extended family, the children of Jefferson's freed sons were still considered enslaved under Virginia law. Sally's extended family, like nieces, nephews, and possibly grandchildren by Beverly, who left Monticello without formal manumission, were also victims of the disgusting slave trade. And that, in a nutshell, is the Thomas Jefferson story. A man who helped spark the creation of our country, who wrote boldly in that declaration that all men are created equal. A man who shut down the transatlantic slave trade. A man who feared what slavery would do to the infant country in the long term. But underneath all that was a man who inherited slaves, purchased more slaves, used slave labor to keep his profitless estate alive, who had relations with a teenaged slave and then kept his mouth shut about his 6 children with her. And while he freed his 4 living children later on, his grandchildren and other blood-related slaves weren't so lucky. Beyond the inhumane way of living, extended families and long-time friendships were shattered when the estate sold off its assets after Jefferson's death. How do we reckon with such a contradiction in our history? Should we separate the man from the politician? Should we still let his words inspire us, even though he did monstrous things in his personal life? Sound off in the comments below with your opinions. Be sure to check out those other videos I mentioned in the description. And of course, like and subscribe to stay up to date with our weekly documentaries. I'll see you next week.